First thing we want to do is look at the minutes of the last meeting. Any corrections or additions to those minutes? Yes? Are you sure? Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that correction. Any other corrections? Okay, so can I have a motion to have the minutes approved as corrected? Motion's been made. Do we have a second? Who made the second, just so I can? Okay, Mr. Zoni, Representative Zoni. Thank you. All in favor of accepting the minutes as corrected, signify by saying aye. Aye. Okay, great. Thank you. Next item on our agenda is the presentation from Mr. Clark. I want to embarrass him with an introduction because it's what I do well. I think he's a familiar face here around the Capitol here. He is the current director of the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at the Central Connecticut State University. He came to our attention as a result of Mr. Rifkin's presentation last week, and some questions came up regarding this institution. As director, Mr. Clark is working to facilitate efficient and effective solutions to critical issues facing Connecticut policymakers. The Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy brings together a dedicated team of CCSU faculty, staff, and students with state and national experts to provide immediate and long-range policy solutions. And he'll be coming to us. He has worked here. He worked in the Appropriations Committee for a number of years, and that's probably where we've seen him. And I will let him expand upon his introduction and introduce the folks he's brought with him to help make this presentation this morning. Again, thank you, Mr. Clark, for being here.
Thank you, Representative Ryan. Always good to see you. So I have Ken Barone from our institute handing out a packet that talks about who we are and our current projects and initiatives. I do know, however, that there were some questions last meeting in terms of what is the institute, in particular relevant to what it was when it left the legislature and got to the university. And I'll just do a little bit to explain where we are now and how we got here, if that's okay with you. So, as Representative Ryan mentioned, I used to clerk the Appropriations Committee, and I was aide to the House Chair, Representative Bill Dyson. I did that from the 2000 session until the 2004 session, and then in 2005 I was clerk of the Transportation Committee. When I was working with Representative Dyson, I did so on criminal justice initiatives because it was near and dear to his heart. And because at that time, in 2000, 2001, when I first started, there was a $1 billion budget deficit. And there was a exponentially rising prison population. It had risen for the past 30 years to the tune of the state putting over $1 billion building approximately 10,000 prison beds in the 1990s. So he was looking at a way to create more efficiencies, to generate greater public safety, and also by being able to minimize costs. So I worked on those things with him at the legislature. And then in 2005, I saw an opportunity to go over to the university system to expand upon that work. And what I noticed was, in the criminal justice arena, a lot of decisions were made from reactions to anomalies or specific cases, and people wanted to address them. And in the work that I had done with Representative Dyson, I found that I came to believe that the best way to address things was in time, with deliberation, with evidence, with an open tent, everybody at the table, all perspectives, coming up to a solution and a goal that everybody agreed upon. And I thought that going to the university would help to bring that evidence and deliberation to the policy process, in particular in criminal justice. So when in 2005, at the end of the session, I was afforded the opportunity to be the lead administrator for the Institute for the Study of Crime and Justice at Central Connecticut State University. And in there, I worked on criminal justice policy initiatives. In particular, the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which was started here in 2003 and 2004. Some of you familiar with the Council of State Governments may know the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. So I did that for a couple years, and then was afforded the opportunity to co-direct the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy. There had been an administrator there who was there for a couple of years. There was one or two particular projects. I know they worked with Lyle Ray and transit-oriented development and various transportation initiatives. But 2 years into it, in approximately 2007, 2008, the Criminal Justice Department asked to take the lead in the Institute for the Study of Crime and Justice. And they did, and we negotiated a way so that the projects that I was doing at the Institute for the Study of Crime and Justice would go over to the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy. And I was told that it was a broad mission, that there was not really any funding for it, and that as a grant and contract funded initiative, we could go where the projects lied, so long as it fit under the goal of municipal and regional policy. And so I did that. And that was in 2007, 2008. And we've been working on those criminal justice initiatives for approximately, 3-4 years. And then we started to expand, and we're now in the process of expanding. In the meantime, the way that these institutes work is that the Board of Trustees originally, and then the Board of Regents now, they initially essentially pass resolutions establishing the institute, and then there's a 5-year period where there's a sunset where they go out of existence unless they're compelled to continue them on. So in 2002, the institute was established. In 2007, when I was directing it, we changed the mission a little bit. And then in 2012, we had another sunset, and we further expanded the role of the Institute, and here we are now. So I have a list of the projects and initiatives that we're working on, and I'm happy to move on to that unless there's any questions on what I was just talking about.
I think once we get a chance to see what you're working on, there might be more questions.
Okay.
So why don't you move on? Thank you.
Okay. So, I know there's some concern in terms of, from what I gather, you all are in a fact-finding phase to figure out who out there can do this municipal work, who out there can help be the engines that drive the goals that you're trying to accomplish. And I would suggest, even though the projects and initiatives that we're doing right now may not apparently align with that, that we are in a good position to assist if necessary and required, and if it seems like a fit for what you're trying to do. One of the things that we are able to do, and which I didn't value completely when I got at the university, which I don't think the legislature necessarily has a window into to the degree that I've been able to understand, is that there are so many resources at a university that could help policymakers gather information and make better decisions. So let me give you an example. We have a number of different disciplines at Central. Teacher education, philosophy. We've worked with folks in political science, media, communications, criminal justice, GIS, mapping, technical education. I mean, you name it. There are people there with expertise that you can draw upon, with resources that you don't have currently at your hands here. Like all the maps and, just the level of technology that's available is amazing, and it should be utilized, in my estimation, for policymaking. We also have hungry students that are eager to learn, that bring with them their own perspectives, a youthful energy, an open mind, and they love working on things like this. We've worked on, you'd think as a policy institute we may have political science majors, but we've had majors from all across the board, and they all get fascinated by being able to work on public policy in ways that they never thought they could. When they're finding out that they're actually able to make a difference, and they're able to use their skills for something tangible, they get a great satisfaction out of it. So there's that. There's that at the university, but we also work within the entire system. Southern we've worked with, Eastern we've worked with. We haven't worked with Western yet, but are looking forward to doing so. We're in a one system now, so community technical students we're looking forward to working with as well. And we work outside of the system as well, because as a statewide policy institute, we believe that we want to get the best information available to policymakers. So we've worked with Quinnipiac Law, Yale Law, we've worked with Wesleyan, we've worked with Trinity College, UConn, and we continue to work with folks that bring a drive and interest in policymaking and assisting policymakers to the table. And we think we're in a unique position to do so. So I'd like to just go to the first project and initiative that's on this packet. It's number 3 here, and the Racial Profiling Prohibition Project. Now, some of you may be familiar with this because of the recent news stories. This is the Alvin Penn Act, and essentially was enacted in 1999. And there was one report done, and then a long time information was not being gathered, analyses were not being done on this, and then the incidents in East Haven caused policymakers up here at the legislature and otherwise to consider, what do they need to do? What is happening with this Alvin Penn Act? How can we put some teeth into it so it actually achieves the objectives that it was meant to achieve? At that point, Undersecretary Mike Lawler of the Criminal Justice Policy and Planning Division, Governor Malloy had just been elected, became aware of a federal Department of Transportation, actually a NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration grant that was available, $1.3 million, to assist states in doing things just like this. And so I had worked with Undersecretary Lawler when he was chair of the Judiciary Committee here, and had developed a good, solid working relationship with him. So he asked us, would you be willing to help put this project together and make it work, and go after this grant and get some funds to do so? And I said, yes, of course. And so here we are, 3 years later, and we went from a system that was collecting information in boxes, non-uniform, annually at best, 27 police departments out of 102 were actually submitting information, to now we have, I think, just about 100% of all of those police departments sending data to us through 26 different CAD RMS vendors, 26 different data points, about 15 million pieces of data we've analyzed this past year to be able to say, does profiling exist, and how can we do something about it? And we're now at the point where by having this information, we can then go year in and year out and see the things that are done to address it, are they doing anything to make a difference? And I think that's a way to get a municipal efficiency. That's a way to do it through a statewide goal. You could do it on the local level. We've collected so much information on traffic patterns, how police departments make decisions. We're now in the process of figuring out why they make decisions. Is there a value of uniformity in police work with regards to things like this? Is there not? Maybe the way tickets and infractions and all that other stuff are done will be changed because of this. And I think that's one of the ways in which we've worked on a municipal level. And I just try to give you a little window into the way. And I was talking with Ray Rosamondo earlier, about things that you could do on the educational policy level and the like. And I think, if we have an open mind towards data and evidence and an open tent, I think there's a way that, we'd be willing to assist.
Can I just add for a second? Good morning, Ken Barone from the Institute. One thing that I think might interest folks is with regards to this racial profiling project, which is probably one of the larger initiatives we've worked on over the course of the last 2.5 years. There are 92 municipal police agencies, 7 special police agencies, the state police, which oversee law enforcement in 81 communities. And here was an initiative that required essentially collecting information from 106 different police agencies, and this is a law that affected all 169 towns. One of the things that we discovered that was a little frustrating is that there are 28 different vendors out there that law enforcement can use, and those municipal officials around the room are probably familiar with this. What we discovered was that everybody is trying to achieve the same goal. They're all trying to collect the same information that was required of them and submit it to a statewide portal, and they're all doing it 27 or 28 different ways. And what became more frustrating was realizing that one vendor that might operate for 15 or 20 different police departments would make modifications to their system and then charge each department separately, right? So it might cost Department A 10 grand, Department B 10 grand, Department C 10 grand, all for the same product. That's essentially a turning on of the switch. So one of the things that we, I think that's an issue, right? I think that's something that certainly we've run into, certainly have some ideas about how that can be resolved. The other piece is that we worked with CROG, the Capital Region Council of Governments, because they were one of the regional areas that seemed to be able to tackle this issue well, in that I think they realized a long time ago that at least they have a public safety committee, and as part of this public safety committee, I think they realize there's all this money that law enforcement are spending for the same product, and is there a way that they can come together as a region and try and achieve efficiencies? And what they did was they essentially contracted with a vendor to create a system that the whole region paid for, right? And then that system is now used by most every police department in the capital region. And every time an update is made to that system, right, different state mandates are passed every year where law enforcement has to collect different information or do things a little bit differently than the year before that. The capital region goes back to their vendor, they negotiate with their vendor, the vendor makes the changes for one cost, and everybody within their network gets that product, right? Which is very different than the issue we're struggling with regards to this project, for instance, in Stanford, where Stanford is the only department that isn't collecting and submitting data as required by this law. And when you dig in and you try and understand the issue that's occurring in Stanford, what you realize is that the technology that they use in their department is part of a vendor that wants to charge them an amount of money that they just don't have. Even when they came together with the other departments in their region that used that same technology, the vendor still wanted to charge, each municipal police agency, the same cost for the same product. So I would just point out that there's something, at least with regards to the way in which law enforcement is operating, that's happening in the Hartford region, the capital region. CROG seemed to be able to address issues like this in a much more progressive way than maybe some of the other regions. And what we're seeing is that down in Fairfield County, there are a lot of police agencies that are constantly doling out money for the same vendor, for the same product. And part of it is that there is some initial investment on the part of a law enforcement department. Let's say, right, if they're using a system that they've used for 20 years to switch to a system that's more uniform for their region or even for the state, right, there's an initial investment that needs to go into making that initial change. And some municipalities just don't have the funds to do that. But I would still point out that probably, if that's something that's of interest to this group, particularly with regards to the ways in which law enforcement technology works, I would say that we should have further conversations with CROG, because they seem to really understand how to leverage law enforcement and the vendor community to save departments a lot of money that can be invested in any number of things.
Thank you.
Here, I'll look at page 5, 6, and 7, and those are the results first, youth violence prevention, and children of incarcerated parents. And all of them deal with essentially social services to some degree on a programmatic level. And, you know, what I've come to realize in my work in this area is that the state does one thing and the municipalities do another, and they both have the same goal, and yet not one knows what the other's doing. So I'll give you an example. We were doing an evaluation of a reentry, a prisoner reentry program in Hartford. And they thought they had their own system designed. This was a state-funded project through the judicial branch. And they designed a system that they thought would be best so that that person would succeed and they'd become productive tax-paying citizens that were able to move on with their lives. Well, come to find out, the municipality had their own ideas on how that family that that person was attached to or that individual and what they needed to do. So one of the things they found was they were handing out bus passes to this individual as they were leaving, and yet the municipality in another program was handing out bus passes to them as well. And it's not to say that the person didn't need all of those bus passes, but not one knew what the other was doing. And I think there's a way you can find efficiencies within social services that would be for the benefit of the state and the municipality. And I just have not seen that really come together. We're trying to make that work in the areas of youth violence prevention, children of incarcerated parents. And we haven't gone that direction with results first, and I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, the Pew folks who aren't talking to us today about this is because their work is mainly on the state level. But I can see down the line that we may be able to get to a place where we can maximize services for the outcomes and then have money and resources for things like transportation and infrastructure, the things that municipalities need to function. So,
And I'll just add that, so I think one of the things that although much of our work focuses in the criminal justice arena, let's just make the point very clear that we are open to working on a variety of state, local, and regional issues. And two, I think we view universities as regional stewards of sorts, right? You have at least in our arena, the 4 state universities, not including UConn, and then 12 community colleges, and they really are, or at least they should be viewed on the part of the state as regional stewards, right? There's a knowledge base there that is not often tapped into as well as it should be. We, over the last, at least Andrew and his team, over the last 10 years, have figured out a way to tap into that knowledge base to address issues in the field of criminal justice. But the knowledge base is much bigger than that. And one of the things I think we have perfected over the last few years is learning how to leverage the knowledge base of the universities within our system. And I think one of the things we've become very capable of doing is to take any issue and to look for the expertise available to us in the entire system to ultimately solve any particular issue. Just as a quick example of something that we did recently, and it was fairly last minute, the State Department of Transportation approached us and asked us to do a report on transportation network companies like Uber and how they fit into the current regulatory schema for taxis and livery companies. And so what did we do? We reached out and identified faculty members at Southern Connecticut State University that had an expertise in the area of transportation, law, and regulation. And ultimately, we, in the course of 10 weeks, produced a product for the Department of Transportation. And I think one of the things that's of a benefit to viewing universities as regional stewards and viewing us as potentially a vehicle to leverage that knowledge base is understanding that we have the ability to navigate, right, a larger system in a way that maybe any particular municipality that might be interested would have a slightly more difficult time doing. So I throw that out there, and the last thing I'll say is that, you know, one of the things that we've tried to sell ourselves on over the last few years is that oftentimes when organizations, state agencies, or even in some of the things that I'm sure you're talking about, municipalities or regions, when you talk about conducting research, doing a study, doing a project, trying to find a solution to any number of problems, oftentimes there are certainly some big organizations, big private companies that exist out there that will do some of that work for you, and they'll do it at a fairly large cost, I'm sure that some folks have seen. And I think one of the things to understand is that, you know, we're operating certainly on a cost level, not to make money, not to make a profit, but and I think one of the things to understand is that the faculty members that do work on any number of these projects do it certainly at a fraction of the cost as you would probably find if you were to go out to sort of a private entity to get that work done. It's part of their mission as faculty members to contribute to the state of Connecticut, to contribute to their region, to contribute to society. It's part of their need to get tenure. It's part of, right? So there's all these things that they can gain benefit from, and I think you folks can gain benefit from. We probably just need to learn to leverage each other a little better. So.
And the other thing about that is the students in the state university systems are predominantly, I mean, I think at least 80 to 90% from Connecticut, and they're going back into the Connecticut communities. So they have awareness of the municipalities, you know, that they bring with them to projects, and it's fascinating to be able to see. The other thing that we've recently added to our list of our cadre of resources that we use are folks that you may recognize, Representative Ryan, Mary Janicki, who used to be in Office of Legislative Research. She was ended up being the director. She worked here for 35 years as an analyst and then director and non-partisan. Jim Fazzolero, who did the same thing in the Public Safety and Transportation Committees. So we find that bringing that institutional knowledge into the academic setting and our policy setting is extremely beneficial. And I could see doing that on the municipal level as well. So.
Any other comments? Was that? I think you kind of touched on one of the issues that came up with Mr. Rifkin, and that is the fact that when he headed the Institute of Public Service, it was located at UConn, and those resources were available. And I think the questions that we had last week is, why doesn't a group like that continue to exist to make use of those resources to answer some of the questions that this group and other groups at the state government level may have? So that's what we were kind of looking for, and part of our discussion, if I remember right, from last week. I guess the other question I had was, when we first initially talked about having the Pew folks come in and speak with us, we were looking at the Results First initiative, and while you're saying today that they kind of work on the state level, I guess reading through this, I guess our question was, couldn't this also be applied at the municipal, local level as well? But you're just saying they're not there yet.
Well, what I'd say to that is we frankly just haven't had that conversation with them. I mean, it was a week ago that I approached them. They're down in D.C., and we had talked with the the Subcommittee on Education, I believe, because there's ways, I mean, essentially what it's bringing is evidence into the public policy arena and looking to make decisions that are cost effective. And the way that we saw a way of doing that in education is we were looking at special education costs. And, you know, you can find out what is the best literature out there to be able to tell you ways that you can maximize the learning of students. And then you can figure that out on the cost level of what's most efficient way to do that, or cost-effective way to do that. And I still think there's a way that can be done. It's just that we haven't had that conversation with them yet. And they're driving a national initiative that has, I think, at this point, 17 states, and it's a big task. And they've started on the state level, and I think they're reluctant to get too far out there before they have a sense of what that means, because they have limited resources. You know, in terms of why an institute does or doesn't exist, all I'll say is, you know, we're grant and contract funded. We're soft funded. We're not guaranteed anything. I mean, I'm in a union, but every year I get re-upped if there's enough funds left in our institute to be able to fund us, and that includes all of the staff. But I started with just me in 2005, and now we have 5 full-time staff and probably at least 7 to 10 part-time staff. We contract out with contractors. We hire student workers. And, you know, we found, I think, a formula to make it work. And, you know, the other thing about us is, and I don't know if this was the same at UConn, is unlike, and this is something that I didn't realize until actually relatively recently, when you look at the state budget, and, you know, I mentioned I was clerk of the Appropriations Committee, and you look at personnel services. Like, we had always been looking at the Department of Corrections and looking how much was in personnel services. Well, you don't realize that the fringes are buried in the comptroller's budget, so you're really only looking at a percentage of what you actually have to pay to keep someone on board. My fringe rate is about 86%, so I have to find the funds to pay for my salary and 86% more of that in order to exist. And that's unique, but that's a way that positions us to understand the full cost of what we're doing, and relative to other agencies and the like. And I think, you know, we've just, as I mentioned, found a way, I think, to make it work with dedicated staff and a university that's supportive of us.
Okay, thank you. I'm a little surprised. Okay, we just gone through the PROPS budgets and we're talking about personnel issues. This isn't the discussion to have here, but your fringe benefits are higher than what we were given, quite honestly. But that's another conversation. Any other questions for Mr. Clark or Mr. Barone? Yes, Mr. Rosamondo.
Good morning, Mr. Clark. I was reading through your results first, and I'm glad you had a conversation about the possibility for results first maybe being applicable to the municipal level. But as you were discussing the example with the bus passes and some other things, and I know you've done work on special education, but one thing I wanted to raise and ask you about is, you know, increasingly our schools are asked to do quite a lot, and the outcomes that we seek go beyond test scores, obviously. They go to creative thinking, critical thinking, being able to collaborate, all sorts of things. And in addition, children who come to the school, particularly in urban areas, come to school with obstacles and challenges that might not be the same as children in other places. And so one effort that has been rather successful across the country and has been gradually gaining momentum is this idea of community schooling. And community school, for example, in New York City, you probably heard about it with Mayor de Blasio. There's examples in Texas, some in Connecticut, where the whole idea is that the school becomes the one-stop place to service all the children's needs. And that would include social services that are existing in nonprofits in the community. It could include municipal services that are available as well, and also those services that are provided by the Board of Education. And the model should be a rather cost-effective model because it really tries to marshal existing services. What I'm curious about is whether your institution or Results First or somehow through a combination could look at that model and the idea that there are these services being provided by various different groups that could come to the school door and be able to deliver those in a more efficient way and in a way that would ultimately improve the outcomes of the schools.
Right. I think that's a fascinating point that you bring up, and I would say yes. And I guess I neglected to mention one of the other motivating factors in our work, and that's passion. And you know, that would be something that I'd be passionate about. I grew up in Farmington. I've lived in Hartford for 20 years, and I have 2 kids in the Montessori Magnet School. And that's one thing that I noticed, you know, from growing up in Farmington, where I thought essentially it was a community school system that I was a part of. You know, we went there during the school year, but in the summer we were there for summer rec, and we did, you know, the school was the center of the community where all the parents were able to gather and learn from each other and meet each other. And I find that that's one of the downfalls of the magnet system, is that it's so fractured. You know, I guess there's always a plus and a minus. The other thing is that it brings such diversity. It's amazing to see, but I don't think it's efficient. You can tell that when the buses are coming in from this, that, and everywhere, and people are driving their kids and all that stuff. But, you know, I think to another point that you made, yes, in particular, I'd say our Children of Incarcerated Parents Initiative has looked at this idea. So children that have incarcerated parents they're not identified in any aspect, in any system in the state. And yet we know, we had a sense, at least, we don't know, we've come to learn, what their particular needs are. We tried to do it in a way that would gather information and get evidence. And one of the ways that we thought was best to do that was we asked ourselves, what system touches all of these kids? And it was the educational system. So we thought, if there's a way that we can identify through the education system who these children are and what can be done in ways that we can provide supports to the schools to be able to maximize their success, we'd love to do that. But it's been a long road, frankly, because initially we weren't sure if actually the education system knowing about them would be beneficial to them. You know, they may get further stigmatized by that. So that integration of social supports and education, I don't have the answer to, but I think it's worthwhile finding out, because I think the goal that you're talking about is a very laudable one. And I think, again, with an open tent, with all the players affected, with a goal in mind, I think, yeah, that's a worthwhile aim.
That being said, anything in the education arena, let's remember this, the 4 state universities started as teaching colleges, right? I mean, they still primarily, right, probably the largest major at all 4 schools is education. And so I would say that all 4 universities probably have some of the strongest, most knowledgeable faculty with regards to anything related to education. So if we're talking about trying to look at or resolve an issue that's related to any aspect of education in Connecticut, I think if you come to any one of the 4 schools, you're probably coming to the right place to find a solution.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Thomas.
Yes, thank you. So if, just to be clear, so if this group wanted to have you all to look into something, do a study, do some research, would we have to help you secure funding, or just how would that work? Say if we wanted to do something on you know, to delve into say special ed even further, or to, you know, look into say the impact of mandates or something like that. I mean, how would that impact you, and how would we go about doing that?
Well, I mean, I'd like to think we're relatively efficient, and it really depends on how you want to start with that. I mean, if all it would take in the initial stages is to get some students to take a look at literature and come back with some ideas and then kind of go from there, we could do that with the resources that we have. Maybe a professor that has a real interest in a particular field. There's a lot of times that professors just volunteer their services because they're really fascinated and they need publications and the like. Legislative funds are always nice, but we are, depending on projects, able to go after grants. You know, we secured a federal grant, we do state grants. We would like to get foundation support in the future. So yeah, I mean, I guess it just would take sitting down and figuring out what exactly the goal is, and we can offer some ideas and see if there's a fit.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Guerra.
Hi, nice to see you again. I was just wondering if you have a board of directors that determines where your priorities should be focused, or if it's like Ryan has suggested, that where people approach you and determine that there is funding available, or help you identify funding resources.
Well, what I operate in the Office of Institutional Advancement, so the vice president essentially sets my goals as the director over a year, 5-year period. We actually just finished our strategic plan, which I submitted to him. And then he operates, under the president, and the university has various goals and missions. And so we attempt to, with the smaller mission that we have, to fit into the larger mission and make it work through that structure. Yes, we did have a advisory board initially for the Institute. When I first took it over, it didn't seem to be a perfect fit for what we were doing, and it's kind of been on the table ever since. But that being said, with each of our projects, like we have the Racial Profiling Advisory Board, where the Sentencing Commission is a full board. Let's see, the Results First Policy Oversight Committee. There's the Children of Incarcerated Parents has a board. We contract with the Racial and Ethnic Disparity Commission, and we have so many boards that we deal with. So I think so long as it fits within our mission, we're comfortable working, on a staff level with an advisory board on a particular project for a particular purpose. So.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Thank you very much for coming. Do you guys ever interact with the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Affairs, ACIR? Or would you consider, because we're trying to, what we're trying to do is expand what their responsibilities are and really try to make it, an organization or a group that lives to its name.
I've heard of it, but we haven't worked with it. But we're open.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Filchuk.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. So I take it from the last couple of conversations that if, say, my group as a Council of Governments, if we approached you and were looking at something that was specific to our region, maybe, and we were willing to pay for it, that's a possibility in terms of a service you might be able to offer.
Yeah, like I said, we're open to anything, and if it's not, depending on where a particular entity is from, like Ken mentioned, we try to leverage the regional resources. So, for instance, we're working on the Youth Violence Initiative in New Haven with Southern Connecticut State University. So we're happy to reach out into the system to figure out what resources would best fit a project. I will say that it is always helpful to have funding to be able to do things, but as I mentioned to Ron, it's not always necessary, at least to get off the go, and then we can always look for if there's state or federal grants to help continue it along. That's always a possibility.
Well, I've hired 2 of your graduates. I don't know if I get a discount for that, but
Sure.
Thank you. Any other questions? Now, you commented, but you hadn't ever heard of the ACIR. Even your capacity as clerk of the Appropriations Committee, nothing came through that committee about mandates or anything of that nature that brought it to your attention?
Not to my recollection. It was a huge learning curve. I had not been in the legislature before to even get to know who was on the committee initially, and then to see what's the work done, and then who's asking for what, and I do not recall. And what's the process? I don't recall ever coming in contact with them.
Anyone else? Well, certainly appreciate you coming in today, and I think Mr. Paul, as head of our policing work group, might be coming back to you with some questions and thoughts about what you said about the CAD system.
Thank you for the
Thank you.
opportunity.
Thank you both for coming in. The next item on our agenda is the letter we received a couple of weeks ago. Mr. Chris from Howington came in and spoke to us about the Resident State Trooper Program. Of course, this kind of came to our fore because of the issues with the budget. OPM and the Department of Public Safety both listened in on that presentation, and we asked them to respond to any statements that were made, answer any of the questions that were coming for us. So we did get a response from the Office of Policy and Management, which we've passed out. And hopefully we're going to be getting one from the Department of Public Safety. I'd hoped to have it by today, but that didn't happen. Any questions or comments on this, or are we just going to let the work group take care of it? Mr. Paul, do you want to say, you're smiling, do you want to say something?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I read the letter, and is there any way that he could come, John Carl Carasa can come and respond to some of the comments that he's made in here? I mean, you know, as an example, he talks about how the state provides funding for communities in other areas, and we should take that and be happy with it. That's my interpretation of what he's saying. And, you know, just for grins, blank and grins, I ran my ECS dollars today. Town of Litchfield gets 0.9%, less than 1% of our annual budget for education. That's not even 1%. We get 1.5 million, and my Board of Education's budget last year was $16.5 million. So to compare what we get from the state in relationship to other funding and what we get in the way of the resident trooper program, I think is inappropriate. And there's other items in this letter that I could go on for the next 20 minutes, and I don't want to do that. I don't want to belabor this. But I would just like to know if we could invite, invite John Carl Casa here to talk about his comments, because I think some of them, and it's another example, the comment that I made about the Troop L. What I'm interpreting what he said about Troop L, sounds like that I was complaining that Troop L was there with his comments about the response time would be quicker and therefore I should be happy it's there. That's my interpretation of what I read. That's completely taken out of context. When I made that comment was in relationship to the fact that I have to work very hard in my community just to keep the resident trooper program in its place. And with a $60,000 increase, that was going to make things difficult because the residents in my community look at Troop L as though it were the Litchfield Police Department, and that's not the case. So I would just like, if at all possible, to invite him here so we can have a discussion about his comments.
Okay, anybody else have any questions? I think I think since we're in the middle of the budget process, to be totally honest with you, we may see them after that process is done. But we were hoping this would be helpful and not incite or bring up more questions than it answered. But I will, if he's not already listening to the message, will. So we will, I think it was our efforts to have him kind of respond to kind of lay some things down but we'll see if he can come later. Okay, I'm just thinking that we're not going to see him before the budget process is done, to be honest with you. And they make me think twice about what's going to happen with the public safety letter. Yes, Ms. Guerra.
Well, I do, just to build on Leo's comments, think it's troubling that on the one hand, we're spending countless hours on the Moore Commission to look at achieving efficiencies. We're pointing to a program that is a regional partnership that is very efficient for small towns. And the letter from OPM basically says, why don't you just start your own local police station, which means we'd be back here in 5 years going, why do we have 169 local police stations? That's so inefficient. Maybe you should consolidate. And it's just very frustrating, I think, because as Leo points out, towns are looking to reduce their burdens and find a way to fund education and public safety without increasing property taxes. Unfortunately, all the budgets I've seen that have been adopted have included increases in mill rates. And so we're trying to achieve efficiencies, and this directive runs counter to that. So it is, again, frustrating. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I know my community is currently looking at leaving the resident state trooper program to establish its own police department, and we did look at doing it with surrounding communities and studied it, and at this point has chosen not to go that way, but that is something we're looking at in that regard. But I don't know how many other communities are doing anything of that nature. Any other questions or comments about the? Yes.
Mr. Chair, I just have one, I just have one more comment. I've got to correct my math. It's not under 1%, it's under 10%. It's 9% of our budget is ECS funding. I just wanted to correct that because I misstated what I intended.
Okay, that makes that still not great, but it still makes more sense. Yeah, okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments on this? All right, oh, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very quickly, when you mention your community is looking at regional policing, I think all of the small towns are doing that. And I think the subcommittee that's meeting right after this meeting, that will be the primary topic, is how do we protect our public safety at the same time we try to keep costs in line. And as we've talked about before, this cost increase is very significant to the small towns. And a police force for the town of Barkhamsted is not practical. So we're really looking at this regional approach, which you mentioned, and, you know, we've talked about some, so thank you.
Great. I'm going to maybe make a few comments about the work groups. I'm glad to see that they're all working pretty well. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I just want to say about the state police program, the resident state troopers program, I think it's the best regional program in the state of Connecticut. I know for small towns, I don't have the luxury of even considering doing a local police force. Regionalizing a police force just wouldn't work. The state trooper program works for me. And I guess another comment is all 169 towns have already done their budget, and they're in the process of public hearings and/or town meetings, and we all go to referendum very, very soon. So to have such a large, this does affect the small towns. I'm looking at possibly not having $171,000, and it's just very, very difficult. And what we will end up doing is we will end up letting go of a state trooper, which the problem doesn't go away from the state, because I know a lot of other towns will eventually end up doing this, which would end up to be more of a cost for the state. So it's just, I agree with Betsy, it's very, very frustrating.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, well, thank you. The next thing, a couple of items that aren't really on the agenda that I thought I should bring up. A couple of weeks ago, we had a presentation on the healthcare pools and healthcare costs in general, and presented by Comptroller Lembo. And I'm just curious if we want to take any further action. Do we want to get more information? Do we want to have a work group on this particular issue? Or are people comfortable where they are with it? Not that we have to do it today, but any comments on that? Yes.
I was very surprised to learn that only 20 or 25% of boards of education and municipalities are even looking at competitive rates at the comptroller's office. So I'd be curious to know what's behind that, how we can increase the rates so that at least they're bringing competitive rates into their decision-making process. I don't know if that warrants a task or a subcommittee of this committee, but it seemed like an issue that requires some follow-up.
I mean, we can certainly have a work group. Nothing says the work groups have to meet forever. I mean, we can certainly have a group that looks and gets some answers to some questions.
Yeah, just a brief response to that. Part of the concern is that in forming a relationship with the state of Connecticut, you give up some of your individual rights as a local municipality, similar to the discussion that we had on the MERS program in terms of our ability to influence the fundings of those particular programs. So based upon the MERS model, there's a lot of suspicion associated with municipalities looking to the state as a coalition for benefits and giving up your local control. There is one coalition. There was legislation passed that allowed communities to come together to form health coalitions, and there is one that has started in the state of Connecticut that Townd is part of, along with Coventry, Putnam, Plainville, and Eastcon, and has been extremely successful. And I think we're still the only regional healthcare cooperative that has joined together. We've saved hundreds of thousands of dollars by coming together as a municipal entity, including both Board of Educations and towns. But that's a very successful model that we would be happy to share with this group, because I'm surprised others in the state haven't followed that model and have joined together. But there is a lot of fear and suspicion, as well as the fact that the state would not allow for high deductible plans. And many municipalities have already converted to high deductible plans, and the state is opposed to those types of plans philosophically.
Would your group be able to come meet with us next week? Would that be too soon?
That might be too soon, but I could see when the executive, we do have a paid staff person, when we could make a presentation, I can get back to you.
We'll get back to you then. That sounds like a good idea. And maybe next week we will pass around a work group sheet just to see who are interested in this issue and if they'd like to get some questions answered in that regard. Yes?
Yes, in further response to the question you raised, and I will second my predecessor comment on the fear and suspicion point. However, in addition to the number who have requested formal quotes, there have been a number of informal observations of the state plan. We have done that, and we've found that the state plan is significantly more expensive than what we're paying. So there's just zero interest in tying ourselves in with a much higher cost plan in addition to the fear and suspicion point. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes?
Thank you. Just real quickly, I think also to go even beyond that, some of us maybe around this table remember MIRMA and a municipal insurance group for workers' comp that basically went belly up and put many of our municipalities in financially challenging situations to get out, and very uncomfortable situations. And I think as a result of things like that, we end up in situations where we look at these things with very suspicious eyes and don't want to get involved in scenarios where we don't have an exit or we get roped into financial challenges as a result. So.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Winograd.
Thank you. I thought that the presentation last time by Mr. Lembo, particularly as to the rates that the state plan, is, I mean, these are startlingly low numbers. That what was it, $1,900 blended rate for family. I doubt very much that even many HSAs are in total cost that inexpensive. And I understand the municipalities' various fears about state control, but I mean, we're talking about a sizable chunk of money into, quote, I think it was Barnes, and this is where the money is. So to pass on the opportunity to hear more about savings in insurance, I think is really makes it harder to, I guess it makes it harder for me to look at other savings as being that significant. The potential for savings here is so great that I do appreciate your idea of having a work group. I think that's a good idea. And I would hope that other objections can at least be addressed, because again, I think that we all know about the high cost of insurance and how fast it's accelerating. And the idea, again, that individual towns are going to be able to prevent extraordinary expenses in the future, I think, is short-sighted. So again, I hope we can continue to have the discussion. Again, I understand concerns, and I heard what people said about MRF, but let's keep talking about this and try to find that those savings.
Hopefully address some of those concerns. Thank you. Any other questions? So we will have a sheet next week. Yes, sir.
As somebody who's worked with our regional school board as well as the state on looking at healthcare insurance costs, we have not been able to find anything that competes with what we're doing with our small group. But the problem, I think, going forward, and why I think we should be looking into this, is that the current system is stacked against the small groups. And it's going to be more and more difficult for small communities to provide this in a cost-effective manner. I mean, so far, I'm beating everybody else in the big pools, but it's not going to last forever.
Good point. Thank you. Any other comments? So we'll have that work group sheet next week. let me ask one more question before, do we have any more information about ACII? You're going to check with them to see what their future plans were? Do we have anything new on that yet?
Bruce Witchen is trying to set up another meeting, and I haven't heard anything back from him since last week. Middle of last week is the last I've heard, and he's trying to set something up with the group.
Just want to make sure I don't forget. Mr. Filchak?
Yeah, and I think I commented last week that I had not heard from them since my appointment last October. I did hear from them within about 2 days of the meeting, so thank you. And we'll see.
I have another question for you, too, when I think about it. Okay, that is that. The other thing, I've seen that the work groups are meeting, which is great. I'll probably be meeting with some of the leaders of the work groups just to see where we're going and what direction we're taking. But I know some of them have been doing really laid some great groundwork, which I'm glad to hear. And keeping in mind that what we're looking for is having recommendations ready by at least, and nothing says we can't do this earlier, but by the beginning of the next session on possible legislation that can accomplish whatever goals your particular work group was working towards. So it's great to see us getting ahead of this, because I think things will slow up as the session goes on, and we kind of have to cut back on these meetings a little bit because of the conflict with session days. And heaven only knows what happens during the summer. Sometimes it's a great time to meet, sometimes it isn't. But it's good to see the work that is being done. I appreciate the work of all the members who are, in addition to these meetings, are also attending work group meetings, which is great. So that brings up the next meeting. I think next week we are back to our regular schedule of meeting on Tuesdays. We do have somebody coming in to talk to us about municipal efficiencies dealing with blight. Folks from Bridgeport, and they're coming up to address that issue. And we'll see how much of an issue that is for the rest of our communities and what we want to do. And we'll see if we can get someone else to also make a presentation. Again, if any of the work groups have suggestions or folks that they would like to see come forward and speak, please let me know. We'll put them on the agenda. And also let me know as the work groups come up with recommendations, if they would want to be put on the agenda to present their recommendations as we come up with those. Maybe I'm a little premature. Let me know about that so they can be placed on the agenda. We can have discussion on those issues as well. So as a body, we can start putting together our list of recommended legislation. Any other questions or discussions before we move on? Yes, Ms. Glassman.
Thank you, Chairman Ryan. Just wanted to report out that the Technology Subcommittee will be having a presentation on May 5th regarding the Nutmeg Network. We're going to hear from Scott Taylor with CEN. He's the network director. Dan Morley from OPM, who administers the funding, and Mark Raymond, who's the state Chief Information Officer for the state. So it'll be a very interesting discussion, and certainly would open that up to the group. We'll send out the time and the location as a reminder if folks are interested.
Okay, maybe that particular week we can use that for our meeting for that point, but that's good to hear. Thank you, unless we're in session. But thank you. Yeah, please keep us abreast of what's going on there. That'd be great. Any other questions or discussions? So right now we plan, oh yeah, Mr. Paul.
The only comment I want to make is that immediately following this meeting right here, we're going to have the Regional Policing Subcommittee meet for a short meeting.
I understand there'll be meeting in this room, right, following this meeting, and the Mandates Work Group will be meeting in room 2600 at 12 o'clock. And the work group leaders, keep in mind that you do have staff folks who will help you find locations for your meetings, which seems like they've been doing, which is great. Any other questions, comments, discussion? Yes, sir, Mr. McPherson.
Mr. Chair, very quickly, I notice we're meeting next week back on our regular Tuesday schedule. Do you have any feel for meetings past that? Will we continue, in your opinion, to meet every Tuesday, do you think?
I wish I could answer that. I think as we get through May, you're going to find that the General Assembly will be meeting on Tuesdays. If they're not meeting too early, maybe we could still meet on Tuesday mornings. But what we might do is we get a better feel, make you aware of that, so that maybe the work groups can meet at those times as we meet probably. I'm going to see some conflicts coming up in May. I just can't tell you where or when yet. And I'd like to see how much work we can get done before we have to go there, if that's all right.
And I'm sure you understand that we all have meetings to reschedule
Right.
and time to block out, so any advance notice would be helpful. Thank you,
And
sir.
we're trying to do that, because I do appreciate that. And we appreciate everybody coming up here and taking time out to, some of you travel pretty good distances to get here, and we really appreciate your input and your effort to attend. Thank you. Right now, it's 10 o'clock next Tuesday. Right? Any reason why it wouldn't be? Okay. Sometimes I'm the last to know things. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so hopefully we'll see you all next Tuesday at 10 o'clock. And the two work groups will be meeting, our police working group in this room and the mandates work group in room 2600. Thank you all.